Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm here with my co-host, Alan Reinach, who is president and general counsel of the Church-State Council, and he's been dealing with church-state issues for decades. I don't want to date you, Alan, but you've got a track record.
Well, I'm married, so you can't.
Okay. Oh no, we're starting off with a bad joke. This is not good.
Well, you're
for the
married
program.
too, for that matter. All right.
Well, this is very true. Moving right along, we are today talking about a topic that sits right in the crosshairs of faith and politics, and that is, how far can you talk about politics from the pulpit? The Johnson Amendment, something that for 70 years has, at least theoretically, been controlling how far houses of worship can officially endorse or argue against political candidates. We are talking to two folk who are leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and really digging into not just the Johnson Amendment, but how the Seventh-day Adventist Church through the years has dealt with this issue of partisan politics in our congregations. So, Alan, why don't you get us started?
We have two guests today. Todd McFarland is general counsel for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists and a very long-time colleague of mine. And Orlan Johnson is Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. And Orlan hosts the weekly television program Faith and Politics. And not to leave you out, Orlan, you and I have been friends and colleagues for quite a few years as well. Welcome to Just Liberty.
Thank you.
And Todd, I think I'm going to direct the first question to you because we're going to be talking about restrictions on political activities of nonprofits and the church, more commonly using the shorthand of the Johnson Amendment, which many of our listeners may be familiar with. What's the origin of this restriction? Because in terms of American history, it's a relatively recent restriction, isn't it?
It is. 1950s. So then Senator Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, won his reelection for senator in Texas by a very thin margin, giving him the nickname Landslide Johnson because I think it was like double-digit votes. But in that election, one of the organizations that worked against him was a church. And so he was not very excited about that. And so in a very Johnson-esque way, he put into the Internal Revenue Code some changes without debate, without any sort of hearings or anything, that limited what nonprofit organizations can do when it comes to election and opposing and supporting candidates. And so this went into the Internal Revenue Code. Like I said, this was not something that's been a rule since our founding by any stretch. It was something that went in without any real discussion. And I would say in its first years, probably without a whole lot of enforcement or even attention. But over the last several decades, it has in fact gotten a lot of attention about restrictions on churches endorsing and opposing candidates and political parties, its enforcement, and people and organizations attempting to challenge the restriction.
So, Orlan, this hasn't been enforced rigorously, right? It's been there, it's existed. In a way, I guess you could argue it's been sort of a yellow caution light for churches before they get feet first into a sort of a partisan political campaign. Yeah. But it hasn't been enforced, has it?
No, not really. I think what was happening is that it was kind of this unofficial understanding that we don't want to see churches, quote unquote, engaging in heavy duty politics. However, I think everyone was quite clear as to the processes, how the Johnson Amendment came into play, that it was really kind of a personal agenda that was taken on by a very powerful politician. And really, I've always been of the agreement that any legislation that's really put in place to punish or to impact only a very small group of people is probably bad legislation to begin with. And I think the overall enforcement from the Internal Revenue Service has been, no muss, no fuss. Let's don't get involved unless we really need to. because then really having to go in and go through the whole administrative process of potentially going through some type of sanction, it really didn't have much, what I would say, in the way of standards or procedures as to how to go forward and do it. So it seemed as though it was one of those things that you were better off just, allowing it to sit on the books, but really not enforcing it in any way. And that's really how it had pretty much been operating for the better part of almost 50 years, I guess.
Well, it almost sounds as if you gentlemen would be just as happy to have the Johnson Amendment repealed.
No, I don't think either Orlan or I said that. Its origin and its enforcement, which has, while not been strenuous, the IRS has in the past done that. It has served, I think, some important roles and so on for the church, namely in keeping churches and institutions out of politics, which I think most churches thinks is a good thing. And so, no, I think this amendment, while it could certainly be abused, even the IRS guidance on its website, I would not agree with everything that they say. But as a general principle, I think this has been a mostly positive.
But we say, yes, it's been a positive, it's been a break on this political involvement by churches. But for 70 years, there have been some evangelical churches that have been expending a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in trying to get it repealed. In fact, President Trump campaigned on this very promise to make the Johnson Amendment go away. So I guess my question is, why have churches felt so strongly about, some churches felt so strongly about that? And I guess I'm curious, because both of you represent the Seventh-day Adventist Church. How does that compare with how the Adventist Church historically has related to the Johnson Amendment?
Well, I think one thing interesting from our church's perspective is that putting rules in place and policies in place, really the enforcement takes place, what I would call with the boots on the ground. If you've got 4,000 pastors in particular across the North American division, the likelihood of all of them engaging in viewpoints in a way that would be what I would call uniform would be very difficult. So realistically, the idea is that you kind of put these policies in place to really kind of act as guardrails to be able to help them to have an idea of how they should move forward. And so the reality is that the beauty of the Johnson Amendment is sometimes people are more willing to adhere to law than they are to policy. And so the Johnson Amendment really kind of gave us what I would call a belts and suspenders approach in being able to say, from a policy standpoint, this is what we believe ought to take place. Oh, and by the way, if you violate this policy, you're also violating the law, and you run the risk of a church organization losing its 501c3 status. And, and the likelihood of you wanting to be known as that individual that kind of created that Pandora's box was one of the things that was also helpful in tamping down this type of activity. But in reality, you've had churches that, not necessarily the Adventist Church, but many other church organizations that had, political leaders. I mean, there have been pastors who've been members of Congress. There've been a lot of work in, the civil rights movement that took place out of many churches. But on the same side, on the what I would call the conservative side, you've had organizations that have really been involved in some politics to some degree as well. I think you can always try to figure out how to keep church out of politics, but it's really difficult to keep a church out of government. And once you get into government and the impact thereof, politics is not that far behind.
So as far as the sort of energy and enthusiasm behind reversing the Johnson Amendment, historically, it was my understanding that the denominations generally supported the restriction because they don't want our churches diverted from their primary mission, which is religious and spiritual in nature, and that the energy has come from independent religious organizations, from some conservative churches, some mega churches. Where are we at today in terms of kind of denominational support or opposition to the effort to get rid of it?
Well, I don't know. Well, I think it has. There's certain advocacy groups that have done that. There have been, like you said, local churches, smaller organizations. I don't know of any major denomination who's come out in overturning it. I don't believe the Southern Baptist Convention has advocated for it. I know the Catholics have not, other religions, but there are significant parts of, and we're talking mainly about Christianity here, though it applies across the board, that aren't part of those, organizations. I mean, some of the mainstreams, like United Methodist and so forth, I mean, those denominations are dwindling in size and Sunday attendance. And so, yeah, it has came mostly from these sort of other organizations. But I don't know that ultimately matters, right? I don't know just because you've organized yourself as a denomination means you should get more say in, what our country's policies are than a bunch of smaller organizations. I think the better argument, though, is that, the fight, quite frankly, is mainly over to what extent churches should be able to do this. So even the most aggressive advocates that at least I've seen talk publicly about it are mainly wanting what ADF called, Pulpit Freedom Sunday, right? That for pastors to say from the pulpit, that they opposed or endorsed a candidate, but not to do and this was the last time the IRS really enforced this. During the Clinton administration, there was a church that took out an ad against Bill Clinton for president, and no one, at least that I've seen, I shouldn't say no one, but no, organization has said that nonprofits should be able to spend money on advertisements for and against candidates. And quite frankly, the IRS's own guidance on what can be said from the pulpit, if you go to their website, it has some lines. I don't know how comfortable we would be, because there are certain topics that if you talk about them are so identified with a particular candidate or political party that it becomes inseparable. And the IRS has said, well, if that's the case, then you can't talk about it during election season. And I think that's somewhat problematic. It needs to be somewhere that's not a wink, wink, nod, nod, this is our candidate. On the other hand, telling a pastor that, 3 weeks before an election, he or she can't speak on immigration or abortion is problematic for the IRS to take that position.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. You need to draw these lines between just preaching on biblical themes that happen to touch on public policy and specifically endorsing a partisan political candidate or party. But it seems to me that the folks that are really against the Johnson Amendment have something more on the table than just prophetic preaching. They do wish to endorse specific candidates and become involved in the partisan political machinery. I mean, there was a lawsuit that was filed a couple of years back, which has sort of brought the Johnson Amendment to the fore in the news, and it was filed by religious broadcasters and by some churches in Texas. And they specifically said that they wanted to engage in this sort of very specific partisan endorsing. So I guess I'm curious, do Adventists want to be involved in that level of political action?
Well, it's 23 million members worldwide. So the answer to almost any question is, do Adventists, as individual members, is yes and no, right?
So no, but from an institutional
from an institutional perspective, no, the church has chosen not to go down that road. Pew Forum a few years ago found the Adventist Church to be the most diverse church in the country in the United States. And with that, and they were talking about racial diversity there, with that racial diversity also comes a significant amount of political diversity. And, what do you do when, in the same town, two Adventist pastors endorse opposite candidates, right? Like, we do not need to be getting in the middle of that sort of issue from the pulpit and the congregation. Yes, those congregations and their members may split their votes and in their personal capacity go and support and oppose candidates. But as an institution, that is just not a road, that leadership and the consensus, wants us to go down. And I think there's a pretty good consensus amongst Adventist pastors and administrators on this.
Well, there's another aspect to this that we really haven't touched on. We're talking about tax policy, tax law. And in America, we fund politics with after-tax dollars, right? If you give a donation to your favorite candidate or your favorite political party, you've already paid taxes on those dollars. But if you give money to a church and a church uses those funds for political purposes, well, you're still gonna write that off as a charitable donation. So that's pre-tax dollars. And it seems to me that, the thing that nobody on either side of this issue is really highlighting is the potential to distort church bodies into effectively political action fundraising machines.
Yeah, and I think to go along with that, Alan, when you think about the power that churches have, the ability to be able to really, in some instances, take in billions of dollars that kind of funnel through religious quote unquote organization. The government and many other authoritative bodies don't get to ask you where it came from, what those individuals do. Are they clean funds? Are they unclean funds? So the reality is the power that churches have been given. I think part of the pushback we're seeing is another part of society that's asking the question as to why are they allowed to run free and to kind of be having on the wild, wild west where the rest of the world needs to know your client, ensure where funds are coming from, clear documentation and things of that nature. And I think what we're starting to see is the understanding that many of us who work in this business don't like to couch it this way, but the work we do is really to create what I would call not just exemptions, but the power to discriminate. And the power to discriminate requires that you have to hopefully use it in a way where it's more of a shield and not a sword. But I think even the combination of understanding these tax principles and knowing that churches are kind of exempt from really having to be involved in it, I think we have a part of our society that doesn't like that. And that's why you see candidates now pushing the whole idea that they're running on a platform of there should no longer be any separation of churches and state, because we think that churches getting a free ride and the individuals connected thereof, aren't being treated like the rest of America.
I agree with Orlan. That's where I think a lot of concern comes from in churches' ability and willingness to sort of stay out of the affairs of government. I mean, that's why the French experience, in the French Revolution, really is why in France to this day you have a very different relationship with government than you in places even like the UK or the United States, where, the government and the, in faith were not so as closely intertwined as it was, say, in France. You have a different relationship. I do think, though, going back to the example there of tax dollars and distorting, that it's true. I also think it's somewhat of a straw man argument, because I don't think that's what most of these organizations are advocating for. In fact, they will say, no, we don't necessarily, think of taking out advertisements. It's just that the pastor, listen, there's a lot of pastors who want to say, well, he's not running for office again, but, Donald Trump is, evil and you should not vote for him. And there's others who think Kamala Harris, his, prior person, or Joseph Biden, or pick your whatever, are the same. And they have biblically based reasons to say that. And, what the IRS has said is, that during a certain time period, when a person's a candidate, you can't do that. Now, right now, you can say as many bad things as you want from the pulpit against Trump, against Harris, against Biden. But if Harris were to, become a candidate again, then you're all of a sudden restricted. And there are difficult questions here. I think early on in this, when this sort of first came on the radar in the early 2000s, everyone sort of was like, oh no, this rule has worked, and it had worked. And we, it's just support the Johnson Amendment, and that's the end of the story. And I do think there's a lot of nuance there. It's all hypothetical, though, because the IRS has done none of this stuff that we're talking about, right? There was one investigation a few years ago the IRS dropped against a pastor who gave a sermon out in San Francisco opposing George Bush. But it's hard to imagine a part of the Internal Revenue Code that has gotten more discussion compared to actual enforcement than this one, right? The ratio is completely off. And it's still, though, it's not that it isn't important, but everything that people come up with is in the form of a hypothetical, both on the left and the right, because none of this has really been tested out.
Well, your
So
point,
you're
Todd.
saying,
Go
you're
ahead.
saying, Todd, that it's more optics than anything else. That
It's
it's symbolic.
It is
Is that what
symbolic.
you're saying?
It is also, though, I mean, again, laws in their enforcement changes a lot. For instance, there's something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, passed in the Carter administration. Wasn't enforced in the Carter administration. Wasn't enforced in the Reagan administration. Wasn't enforced in the first Bush administration. Wasn't really enforced during the Clinton administration. You then get into the 2000s, and all of a sudden, this, George W. Bush starts enforcing it. Now, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a major concern for any multinational organization. And I'm not saying that's good or bad one way or the other. I'm just saying don't assume that a law that hasn't been enforced will not get new legs. And just to be clear,
Right.
while George W. Bush started enforcing it, every administration since then has continued it. So you can't just sit back and say, don't worry, it's not being enforced.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess,
all right, but
go
Tina,
ahead,
what you
Alan.
described as optics, I would describe as politics. That, I mean, Todd, if you're correct, then pretty much both on the left and the right, everybody's been doing what they want to do, regardless of the Johnson Amendment,
Right.
in terms of talking about candidates, talking about, elections, and the use of the Johnson Amendment as a punching bag is simply to rally the troops around their side.
It is, but also I do think, it is constrained pastors and denominations, right? Like if this was not on the books, you would
Right.
see a whole lot more of this. I do think the people who have said this in the pulpit are people who, aren't connected to major denominations, so they're kind of free to do what they want. And second, the people that are really willing to push the envelope either by personality or say they're close to retirement or whatever. There was a situation with another denomination, a more left of center organization, in which a clergy member really wanted to speak out on this and got a lot of pushback from his denomination. And it's not accurate to say this has had no constraining or guardrails on it. And quite frankly, right now, I think the IRS, or how it's been practiced, has not in every circumstance, but more or less gotten it right. But there are, do you really want to turn the pulpit on a Saturday or Sunday morning into a political venue? And I think most churches, the answer is, regardless of IRS regulations, the answer is no. I mean, when I go to church on Sabbath morning, I don't want to see some candidate up there. I got enough of that with my day job during the middle of the week.
Well, one argument against the Johnson Amendment is that it gags people, that it suppresses their constitutional free speech rights. I guess a counter argument to that is tax exemption is a privilege, not a right, and the government can ask legitimately for certain conditions to be met for you. I mean, because other conditions are attached to that tax exempt status. So the whole free speech argument becomes a little bit of a straw argument. What do you think, Orlan?
Yeah, I think it is kind of becomes a straw man argument to some degree because, the idea of free speech is, something that we all are pretty aware still has limitations. You still can't run into the theater and scream out fire. So the idea that you get to kind of do whatever you want to do and say what you want to say is really more a concept than reality. And I think the fact of the matter is that, my thought process is, going to church and experiencing whatever you need from a religious standpoint. When you're there, you should just keep the main thing. I don't think anybody thinks that part and parcel of church should be engaging in political viewpoints and, showing up wearing your favorite candidate's hat or T-shirt and from the pulpit and saying, well, I'm not telling you what to do, but then you flash like you're Superman. And then, you're playing your own other games that's going on. Now, I think the point that you've raised regarding prophetic preaching and the fact that in the society we live in right now, everything is politicized. I mean, you buy a certain brand of milk and that means you're of one party. I'll tell you. So So, so even when you're trying to just do what you normally do, somebody can point at you and say, "Hey, that's a libertarian product there," or, that's a, Catholic product there. So, I think we're kind of a little bit in the silly season of politics, and hopefully there may be a group that can figure out how to pull it back in a different direction. But I think there was a point in time, probably, maybe in the '60s, that we probably saw going to a lot of African American churches that it was probably as much a political rally as it was, really, a church experience. So, I think you kind of go through these cycles, and I think depending on who's at the top of the totem pole from a political leadership standpoint, you kind of lean in different directions. I think we're going through a season right now where people are getting a little bit more connected with the idea. You know what? There's no problem with being involved in politics on a personal level, but do I really want this happening at church? And I think even the most extreme on both sides are really coming to the conclusion, this is probably not the place for it.
Well, I really appreciate this discussion. I think, Orlan, you hit the nail on the head. And if there's a point that I want to kind of sum this up with, it's let's keep the main thing, right?
Main thing.
Church is where we go to find spiritual insight, nurture, community, all kinds of things like that. We don't need to go to church to, identify and find community around politics. Let's focus. Here we are as we're recording. We're heading into the Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday seasons, and it's a good time to remember, especially as Christians, but whatever one's faith is, what the main thing is. So thank you for being with us today on Just Liberty.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Bettina, one of the things I think I disagree with Todd on, and he won't be offended because he and I disagree, plenty, and we're still friends. But, he seems to think that the extent to which opponents of the Johnson Amendment want to bring politics into the pulpit is just that, to be free to do what they want with their own pulpit.
Right.
And see, maybe I'm being cynical, but I have what I think is a realistic viewpoint that, people will do what they can if they're permitted to, right? So if they're able, if there's no restraint on fundraising for political purposes with pre-tax dollars, they're going to do it. It's going to happen because they can do it. Any loopholes, people will take advantage of. Some people will. Maybe there's plenty of people who don't want to go down that road, but there are some who will, and it will inevitably distort our politics.
No, I agree. I agree with that. And I think Todd's point was that these are going to be outliers. At least that's what I took from what he was saying. But even having that as an outlier activity, it's not something we want within the American political system. We don't want churches being fundraising bases, pre-tax dollar fundraising bases for political parties. I think the bigger issue here is, it's not what we want in terms of our democracy. It's really not what we want in terms of our houses of worship.
Right.
This is
right.
is just a distortion of what it means to minister to all people in the pews, not just those who hold to the same political beliefs. I can't remember whether it was Todd or Orlan pointed out that we are a diverse church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is diverse. I saw statistics recently which show 24% of us lean heavily Democrat, 22% of us lean heavily Republican. And then as you trace the sort of different levels of leaning left or right inward, it splits almost evenly within the church. It's astounding how even along the political spectrum we are. And I think as soon as either a pastor or a administrator puts his or her thumb on the scale in favor of one political party or another, we have just, shot ourselves in the foot. We can no longer minister to all our church members.
One of the things that I have fun with when I'm preaching is I'll say, did you know that there are people in this church who voted Republican? And there are people in this church who voted Democrat. And we're all brothers and sisters in Christ.
So, Alan,
go ahead.
No, I'm just a little frightened because we must think very similarly, because I have a little joke I always tell. I say, I've been editor of Liberty magazine for 5 years now. And did you know that not all Adventists vote for the same political party? And it always gets a laugh. So,
Right.
Alan, I don't know. It's a scary thing. We're actually starting to preach alike.
It's a scary thing if we're thinking alike. Well, but, I have to say, Bettina, in these interviews, we may have similar ideas, but we come to the interview from very different sort of places and goals with the interview. And I think they're much, much stronger because they're not just me or just you.
Yeah.
So this has been fun.
It has been fun. And I think this topic is one that we will return to in the future. The Johnson Amendment, whatever its fate, we're going to have to come back to it.
Well, look, money in politics is a big deal. It's been a big deal politically for a long time. There's been a lot of criticism, for example, of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court that opened up the floodgates, right? And I recently saw a brilliant proposal from an economist who served in government. And apparently, the state of North Dakota, I believe, has introduced a measure that would deprive corporations organized in North Dakota from spending money on politics. Because corporations are creatures of law, right? They're created by, so if the states, if some states restrict, then the corporations are going to reincorporate in other states. Right?
Exactly.
So it would have to become, really a nationwide movement. Although not every company is going to reorganize in Delaware or what have you. But I think it's a very interesting proposal that, yes, we do have the power to decide how much political influence we want to give to our corporations. So anyway, that's kind of an aside topic, but the broader topic, I think, is really not just speech, but it's money.
And on that note, let's call it a wrap, Alan. Until next time, remember the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.